Hi everyone, we are talking today about female hormone patterns. Now we're going to break this section into two. We're going to talk about patterns of excess, we're going to talk about patterns of deficiency. And if that sounds like Chinese medicine, that is the broad way we're looking at it, but don't worry if that's not what you're into, because we're still going to talk about the conditions. We're still going to talk about some of the differences between them, but largely, and even if you don't understand a lot of that kind of eight principles type stuff, there's a lot that can be said in terms of these conditions look similar and these ones look similar, and how we treat them botanically really is, as you'd expect, quite similar. We're going to look today at what we're going to call conditions of excess. We'll explain a fair bit about what that means. But what that means in terms of our conditions are PCOS, endometriosis, and fibroids. Obviously those are different, but we're going to talk about kind of how they're the same, and we're going to talk about what we do to treat them botanically. It is largely certainly overlapping, and in some cases exactly the same. I do have, even to kind of put it out there from the beginning, I effectively have one formula that I use. I call it my female hormone excess regulating formula. Nothing special about that. We're going to mostly see, I mean, it's not exactly, and I do make a lot of variations, and this is very common with formulas where you start with a base template and then you individualize it. Okay, I've got this patient, so this herb's going to come out, or at the very least this herb's going to come down. This herb, okay, I see more inflammation, or I see more cramping, I see more pain. This herb's going to get dialed up. So we start with a base and then we individualize from there. Really good way to use some of our formula templates. We'll look at a case, and we've made this 26-year-old. Well, obviously all of them have to be women for these next two sections. We're going to say a diagnosis of PCOS. PCOS is the most commonly diagnosed endocrine disorder in women. And if you read any article about endocrine disorders in women, or even just regulating the menses, you'll always see that phrase, PCOS is the most commonly diagnosed. And the challenge is, even within PCOS, there are multiple different differentiations. There are definitely different patterns of PCOS. There's the very classic PCOS, which is going to be different than fibroids and endo, although they will all have some overlap. There's a very classic PCOS where we have usually a strong, it's kind of like you can see the androgens. You can see stronger development, sturdier shoulders, stronger jaw, often just a hardier looking woman. And then we almost always see acne, and we see usually a good physical fitness, but we also tend to see easily angered, or has quite a strong anger as well. So this would be kind of our classic PCOS presentation, but I don't want you to get too attached to that. Now when you see that, you can right away think, okay, I'm not even very attached to the diagnosis or the label, let's say, of PCOS. It's more like, okay, here's a pattern that we know. Here's what we know about it. We know hormones are going to be dysregulated. We know that blood sugar almost always is dysregulated as well. And of course, we know we're going to have androgens being in excess. We're going to talk about what to do about some of that. So we've got, in this case, we've got chief concerns are an irregular cycle. Sure, yeah, you're going to see lots of that. That's definitely one of the most common things we see. And 24 to 42 days. One of the things we'll start to differentiate through our sections is, what is a long period? What does a short period mean? Now, the challenge is we can have deficiency and excess patterns that give us both. However, it's usually not very hard to tell them apart. And actually, that's a really good point to make. When you see a deficiency pattern and when you see an excess pattern, very rarely will you get those two mixed up. And often in the case where you do get it mixed up, it's because there's actually a deficiency that's causing the excess. Extremely painful cramping before the onset of flow. Here is one of our first places to make a differentiation. This one, again, is borrowed from TCM, but it's very reliable. And I'm sure you already know this if you've come this far. Before flow equals stagnation, maybe stasis, maybe some other things, but we're just going to keep it really simple. Cramping and pain before flow equals stagnation. After equals deficiency. This type of pain will usually be its worst around day 3, maybe around 2 or 3. Now you're probably asking the question, well, what if we have both? Can you have a blood deficiency and a liver qi stagnation? Absolutely you can. You can have both. The challenge with a lot of these conditions is it would be nice if it were just one thing, and sometimes it is, but often we do have multiple things. And often this is why we're going to get into that TCM piece here in this section more than others, because I think in this section more than others, it lends us a way of understanding, okay, what's going on here? What caused what I see? And knowing that really does help us improve our treatment. I haven't actually answered this question for a while, though usually when I do a live class, I say, okay, how often do we see it? How often do we see this? Every single day. Even if you aren't all that interested in working with female hormone balancing, which I wouldn't say I'm disinterested in, but I've never put myself forward as, oh, this is something I really do. And yet I see it every single day in practice. One of the most common things people go see their NDs for, partly because there aren't that many other things that they can do. And we have so many things. So we talked about how common is it? Very common. How good are we at this? We are excellent at this. There, of course, are exceptions, and there are always difficult cases, but for the most part, we're very good at regulating the menstrual cycle. And for the most part, the way of framing it that helps us get into understanding excess, deficiency, some of those other things, I think is best. Now you might be saying to yourself, I'm not interested in any of this TCM stuff, and we've got piles of lab tests. Many practitioners who specialize in women's health, which is usually what we call it, run lots and lots and lots of tests. I'm not opposed to that, even if the creep in my voice suggested perhaps I am. I'm not fundamentally opposed to it. I just find it's often not that necessary. It's often not that useful. Some would obviously disagree, and that's fine. We can talk about it in a debating kind of way, but I think most of the time your treatment becomes your test, because if the patient responds to your treatments, then you probably had it figured out. I also find the challenge with a lot of these tests is women's hormones, and we know this, people who do the testing, we're like, yeah, we know that. Women's hormones change so much during a cycle, and they can even change so much during a day that, again, it gets challenging. You need a lot of points, and it's just expensive. And it's hard to get that many data points throughout a cycle. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. Obviously, when we get into fertility, that can be a big part of understanding what's happening, to try and bring it back into balance. But this isn't a lecture necessarily about fertility, although some of the things will overlap. A lot to say about this topic. Huge amounts. Thick books are written about this topic. But what I hope will come through in our we're going to do 2 sections on this, really is that it doesn't have to be that complicated. And start by treating what you see. If you see an excess pattern, you will probably know it. Part of what helps us determine that is what we saw already here. Cramping before flow tells us there is stagnation. After flow tells us there is deficiency. Menses is heavy. Heavy bleeding. Always 98% of the time equals heat. And this is a really important point to make, because I only recently sort of heard this described as such, and I really like it. It's the idea that often we have women who are anemic. We can set TCM aside for a moment. We have women who are anemic, and yet they still get really heavy periods. And so we start to think to ourselves, well, why does that happen? Why would a body that knows it's anemic still make not just a period, but a heavy period? Now we know lots of women who become anemic, their periods stop, or they become delayed or scanty, and that's a pattern we'll look at in deficiency, and that's very common. But we do certainly see heavy flow and anemia, and in the woman that we see, we still see that excess pattern. And this is really quite fascinating. It's the idea that, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit into some of our TCM, but this part isn't specifically in there. Wherever there's stagnation, we get heat. And we get stagnation transforming into stasis. And stasis is things that we can find. So fibroids, these are sometimes thought of more as phlegm, but fibroids, and especially endometriosis, are considered stasis, as are tumors. And those are considered toxic heat. All cancers or all tumors are considered toxic heat. And so the TCM explanation here is pretty interesting. It says, even though blood deficiency is bad, stagnation leading to heat is worse, and bleeding, particularly menstrual bleeding in this case, is how the body clears, sheds, and relieves heat. So we're having a clearing of blood, which helps prevent, of course, blood stasis and further stagnation, and we're having the release of heat. So the idea here is that it's more valuable to release and clear heat than it is to actually hold on to that blood for the purpose of obviously having enough blood. And I find that very interesting because I'm always fascinated by the body's compensatory mechanisms. Okay, this isn't good, but it's better than this. We see this so often in digestion. This isn't a lecture on digestion. We see it so often in digestion. This is a physiological compensation that comes at a cost. Heavy bleeding comes at a cost, yes, but it's better than paying the price of stagnation and heat transforming. Hopefully you found that interesting. I personally find it really quite fascinating, and I'm always even amazed by what the body does and how the body adapts and copes and does these things. So we'll often see heavy menses, and clots always easy. I mean, a clot is literally blood stasis. And so whenever you see a clot, you can say right away, okay, we've got clots, therefore we have blood stasis, therefore we have chi stagnation. I think you always have to have those two together. Very common presentation. PCOS or not PCOS, very common presentation. Clots is a great example where women will say like, yeah, I have clots, that's pretty normal, right? And the answer to that is, it's very common, but common isn't always normal. That's actually probably even an important phrase to write down. Common does not equal normal. And I use that phrase with patients often because they usually get it. They're like, oh, okay. And it tells us something's shifted out of balance. Might not be a disaster yet, but something shifted out of balance. We need to bring that back into balance. To keep this case simple, so that we can kind of illustrate our key learning points, we've said no history of oral contraceptives, no previous pregnancies, no complications. We're just keeping it really simple. Some women go on and off the pill, no problem. Some women have irregular or dysregulated menses. They go on the pill, they come off the pill, and the menses is regulated now. Other women had regular menses, they go on the pill, they come off, and now their menses is dysregulated. So obviously oral contraception, it doesn't even have to be any hormone-based contraception, will have an effect on hormones, endogenous production of hormones. It's not always negative, and I think that's somewhat important to point out. But however, sometimes it does lead to problems. And that's true also of some of our herbs. If you start messing with hormones, you've heard me say this so many times, if you start messing with hormones, there will be consequences. They're not necessarily bad consequences. Sometimes they're desired outcomes, but sometimes they are undesirable outcomes. So when you start messing with hormones, be careful, because there are consequences to plucking strings of that whole endocrine system, that whole endocrine instrument, if you will. Okay, so we've got, takes a lot of Tylenol. That's usually, in fact, that's a good key indicator that you're having success, is that reliance on any meds, particularly in this case, ones that help to treat pain. So seeing that decrease is a good sign you're pointing in the right direction. Mild signs of androgen excess. So we've got square jaw, strong build, increased libido, and mild acne along the jawline. Now, why did my voice go up with increased libido? Because, one, sometimes this is the one thing women like about their overall pattern. Like, well, my libido is pretty good and I'm pretty strong. So the outcomes associated with higher androgens sometimes have some positive benefit. But I don't say it only to mention that. One of the herbs that's over here, which we can't actually see because it's too low, is Vitex. And I want to mention this one specifically a few times during our session today. Vitex will decrease this libido. And that's not without consequence. Many women do not want their libidos decreased. And in many women, so this is a big thing, in many women who are deficiency patterns, we still see Vitex prescribed. And what we have there is, I won't say a further deficiency, but Vitex is cooling, it's suppressing, it's dispersing, which is exactly what we want. If we've got excess heat, damp heat, we're going to look at that. So Vitex is a good choice there. When we've got deficiency, I'm not so sure Vitex is a great choice. And, if you look at the common names of Vitex, monk's pepper, chasteberry. What do those names suggest? Well, they suggest that it's a good way to help keep women chaste by bringing their libido down. And I don't know much, I know a little bit actually, about monasteries, and it is pretty tough being a monk and being celibate. That could be true for men and women, of course. So they would give a herb that, they would grind it up. It's little tiny berries. They would grind it up, put it into the food to try to decrease the libido of these rowdy monks. So be careful there. Okay, let's look. It's a lot of stuff to this one. It's fun. I enjoy teaching this section because there's so much to say. And it really is quite fun because it's a lot of physiology. There's a lot of really comprehensive physiology that is pretty fun to get into. So we've got a long list of herbs. We'll get into some of our actions. We'll talk about our herbs, of course, as we build the formula. Let's talk about our outcome measures before we get into what I've already started to drift, but I really like it. We have got nothing surprising. Regulate the length of the menstrual cycle. Yep, I would say 26, that's a little short, and 30 is a little long. But if it's between this, I don't really worry too much. If a woman says, yeah, it's somewhere between 26 and 30, okay. Tells us we can still do some tightening up. We can still get some regular. A lot of women's cycles are very regular, 28 days, always 28 days. And when that's the case, wonderful. But I don't worry about a little bit of variation. Regulating, though, is what we want. Reduce cramps, sure. Decrease reliance on, usually that's OTC. Resolve or improve acne, sure. There's lots we can do with herbs here. And sometimes it's bring back, revive a period. We'll see that more in the deficiency section because usually, always when a woman who is of childbearing age, I don't never quite know the proper way to say it. When a woman who should be having a menstrual cycle is not, there's always a reason. Our job is to find that reason and to correct that reason, bring that back into a balance. In fact, a very reliable predictor of health in women in that age range is a regular menstrual cycle. If a woman in that age range says, my menstrual cycle is very regular, no clots, a little bit of cramping, but it's not so bad, and then their digestion is okay, and their sleep is okay, chances are their life is okay, and that's kind of what we want to see. In fact, in a lot of ways, what we do as NDs is we take these broad variables, menses, digestion, sleep, energy, mood, broad variables, and we just see how they fall, and then we nudge them as they need to be nudged to try to keep someone in that balanced position. Menses is a great indicator of how things are doing. Okay, let's do it. Let's get into our TCM integration. Now, I actually trimmed this down a little bit because there's so much to say. And it's, again, not incorrect. There are multiple textbooks written about this. So I'm going to hit the highlights. And I'm going to try to really stick to what is useful in understanding in terms of what you can do treatments. Menstrual blood, often called tiangui or heavenly dew. Interesting way to think about it. It's a manifestation of Jing in women. It is roughly the equivalent of, in fact, this is even better to say semen. Semen is the heavenly dew of men. Menstrual blood is the heavenly dew, the tiangui of women. So women lose their Jing through menses, through producing an egg and that special menstrual blood. Men lose it through ejaculations that release semen. So those are kind of interesting because men actually have much more control. I mean, obviously there's going to be a decline over time over how frequently they're draining that bank. Women more or less have to have that drained, X percentage every time they make a cycle. Tiangui is a combination of liver blood plus Jing and activated by heart yang. So we've got the liver, the kidneys, and the heart that are all involved here. The liver's the boss. Anytime menses is not normal, then we know liver is involved. If menses is not normal, always think of the liver because the liver really coordinates. It is specific. It's not just blood. It's liver blood that is used to make our tiangui, the lining of the uterus. So the liver must be nourished and imbalanced. Those are different things. It must have enough blood to do its job. It must have enough qi and yang to do its job. And it must not be stagnant so that it can be in balance. I'm not going to go into these next parts very much. The chongmai, which is we sometimes call the penetrating vessel. And we've got some other things here. These are live links. I've tested them. They work. So obviously you can't do it directly from the video. But in your note pack, these will take you to very short note packs also. that will give you a little bit more info if that's what you're looking for. The primary TCM patterns in excess conditions reliably arise from liver qi stagnation and liver blood stasis. That's pretty much it. It's a failure for some reason of the liver to be able to ensure the smooth flow of qi and blood. Most of the patterns that's the consequence, the outcome that we see in most of the patterns. These conditions produce stagnation, and almost always they produce heat. Almost always they produce heat. It is the heat that agitates the blood that gives us most of these characteristic symptoms. So we see heat rising up. That's the acne, that's the anger, that's even, it's, comparable to androgens, but that's the heat rising up. It's also the heat that sometimes injures digestion, but it's the heat that accumulates and sticks. So if you think of the entire female reproductive system, so the uterus, the ovaries, the cervix, the vagina, the whole thing, everything in there, that's all the domain of the liver. And whenever the liver is not coursing smoothly, we get stuck heat accumulating in there, and that's really the explanation for a lot of the problems that we see there. So in most cases, probably all cases, there's going to be an element of dampness or phlegm as heat, and this injures the fluids. Almost all cases of PCOS, endo, and fibroids are going to be damp heat and blood stasis. Now that's going to be a little different because obviously they're different conditions. It's going to be a little different for different cases. Sometimes, and I've heard this both ways, but often fibroids are said to have more phlegm, and endo is more blood stasis. Now that's maybe useful, but also again, don't worry about it too much. It probably doesn't change what you do for treatment much or at all. We need to look at one other pattern because we're going to see this. This is where we have a deficiency underlying creating an excess pattern. So this is where if the source qi is deficient, the yang to some degree is deficient. So remembering that the liver is a yin organ with yang functions. Now it has some yin functions too, but it has to have enough energy to do its job. And this is really important because we see this. If the liver doesn't have enough energy to do its job, can't do its job, the natural consequence of the liver not being able to do its job is stagnation, stasis. When those happen, we get heat, we get blood stasis, we get phlegm building up, we get heat building up, and it gets messy. It gets messy, sticky, and hot in the reproductive system. Those are the outcomes. Now, when we have a lack of energy so the liver do its job, we also have a general lack of yang overall, and that will give us more of a cold pattern. So if you see an obvious stagnation pattern, but you look back, you're like, there's cold there. There's a lack of heat there. That's almost always what we have, is kidney yang deficiency leading to cold stasis or cold phlegm accumulation obstructing. So you can even have cold in the kidneys, but heat in the liver. And this is even to make it just a little more complicated for it. Heat in the liver/liver meridian. What does that even mean? Well, to some degree, like we said, the whole reproductive system is the domain of the liver. So, stagnant liver heat, stickiness shows up there. But also we can have the genitals themselves. If you've got any kind of itching, redness, oozing, that's often considered, it doesn't have to be stagnant heat, but damp heat in the liver meridian. Okay. I'm not going to say any more about the TCM integration or the TCM approach. Hopefully that is helpful. Hopefully it's not more confusing. It shouldn't be, because if it was, just set it aside. Just put it over here and be like, I'm not interested in that, or I'll come back to that another time. I don't know about these weird words you're using, heavenly dew. I don't know if I fully grasp that. No problem. Okay, let's take a look let's end this video here, and we'll come back in the next video and we're going to look at the actions and we're going to look at building our formula.